This is Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Frazier. Federal courts have recently handed down major decisions against big pipelines that would transmit oil and gas around the country. And other big pipelines are facing legal challenges that may put them out of business. In one case, a judge ordered the builders of the Dakota Access pipeline to drain it of oil while it resubmits to a major environmental review. The Keystone XL pipeline is also subject to a pending legal fight, and court battles played a role in the decision by one company to abandon another project. What do these decisions mean for America's continued oil and gas buildout, or the Trump administration's campaign for energy dominance? Today, we're going to talk about this and what it means for the future of energy with Ellen Gilmer. She's a reporter with Bloomberg Law. Ellen, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's start at the Dakota Access decision. Ellen, can you just refresh our memories? What is the Dakota Access pipeline and why has it been so controversial?
Dakota Access is a pipeline backed by a company called Energy Transfer, and it's a pipeline that moves oil from North Dakota, where there's a lot of shale development, moves oil to Illinois, where it connects to this big other network. So various permits were approved by different agencies under the Obama administration back in 2016. And a lot of listeners might remember there were huge protests that year. Thousands of people went to North Dakota just outside of the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. So this pipeline crosses a body of water about a half a mile north of the reservation. There's a lot of tribal opposition to the project for that reason. So a lot of indigenous advocates and environmental advocates turned up in North Dakota in 2016 to just make it known that they really had big concerns about this project being put there and about the project being built at all. The Obama administration ended up withholding a permit, agreed to do some more environmental analysis, and the Trump administration reversed course. The pipeline got built, and it's been delivering oil for 3 years.
So the pipeline's already been pumping oil for 3 years. What did the judge in this case decide, and I don't know, how big a deal was it?
So there's been this litigation going on this whole time. Since 2016, since the time the pipeline has been moving oil, there's still been active litigation. And the judge ruled that the Army Corps of Engineers, which is a federal agency that approved one of the key permits for Dakota Access, it didn't comply with the National Environmental Policy Act when it approved that permit. It didn't properly consider that there was a lot of expert disagreement about the oil spill risks. That's what the judge determined. So the judge actually determined that earlier this year. And then he said, well, I'm going to, hear from the parties and figure out what should be the consequence of this decision. Does this just mean the Army Corps should do another environmental review and the pipeline can stay in place in the meantime? Or does it mean that the pipeline should shut down? So on July 6th, we got the answer from the judge, and the judge said the pipeline's got to shut down. He gave it a deadline of August 5th to empty it of oil and to stay that way while the Army Corps does this court-ordered environmental review, which is expected to last into 2021. It's already on appeal. The decision is on appeal. The status of that shutdown order is very much up in the air. Right now, it's actually on hold while an appeals court takes a look at the issue. So it's kind of an open question whether and when a shutdown would actually happen, but it was a huge win for the tribal advocates. It's the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and other tribes that were opposed to the project, and it's just really gratifying for them after so many years of litigation to get a big decision in their favor.
Yeah, is this something that happens a lot, that a judge will order a pipeline to just shut down and drain all the oil out?
No, it's unprecedented. There has never been a major oil pipeline forced to shut down for inadequate analysis under NEPA, the law we mentioned, the National Environmental Policy Act. It's never happened before. There have been some smaller shutdowns or construction stoppages for other reasons, but they've usually been like projects that are just in the works or very, very small natural gas gathering lines. Nothing this major.
Yeah, so talk to me about the company's response. They're fighting this.
Energy Transfer, which is a Dallas-based energy company, they're ready to, pull out all the stops to make sure this shutdown doesn't happen. They have a strong legal team working on the case, and they're pursuing all their legal options. They got a temporary relief from the DC Circuit, which means that, for a short term, they know that the pipeline is not going to go offline right now. And they're pursuing that appeal at the DC Circuit, so it remains to be seen what the final conclusion is going to be at that court. But they'll go to the Supreme Court if they need to keep this pipeline open. The company announced a day or two after the court decision that it hadn't taken any steps to shut down the pipeline, and it wasn't planning to. This statement was seen by a lot of critics as kind of an act of defiance by the company. The company later walked it back and said, of course, we're going to comply with a court order. We never said we wouldn't comply with a court order, but we're just so confident that we're going to win on appeal that this shutdown is never going to happen.
So I want to just go back a little bit into the judge's decision. Why did he say that the environmental review was not done properly?
A lot of it was focused on this issue under the National Environmental Policy Act of when a broad environmental analysis is required. So basically for Dakota Access, the Army Corps did what's called an environmental assessment, which is a type of study that looks at a lot of impacts. It decided not to do an environmental impact statement, which is a different type of study that's just bigger. It looks at all these alternatives. It's just a much more in-depth exercise. So under NEPA, the law, when a project's impacts are considered, quote, highly controversial, that means the agency should be doing this more in-depth environmental impact statement. And so the judge decided that the impacts of Dakota Access were highly controversial because there's expert disagreement about the impacts of an oil spill and the risk of an oil spill and how that could affect all the tribes downstream that rely on that water.
I see. So what is the Trump administration saying about this? And what impact does this have on Trump's agenda, which is very much let's push these big oil and gas pipelines further, because that sort of suits his vision?
This is another example of the federal courts providing a check on the Trump administration's efforts to streamline environmental reviews and to really push through energy infrastructure, particularly fossil fuel infrastructure. This was something that the Obama administration initially approved, then decided to do some more study. President Trump made it one of his first priorities when he took office was to get this pipeline on track, and he did it successfully. So this is a real setback to what had otherwise been a really big, campaign promise he delivered on. The Trump administration has been pushing this policy of energy dominance. They want to prioritize the development of U.S. energy and especially fossil fuels. And building the infrastructure to move those fossil fuels is a critical part of that. The more that courts step in to require additional environmental review or any other kind of reason to slow down development or delay permits, that just makes it harder to reach this idea of energy dominance. It remains to be seen what the impact would be on actual oil and gas production in North Dakota. So it really affects American energy development in a couple of different ways, and it shows how no matter how committed the president is to pushing the energy dominance agenda, there will always be uncertainties based on how courts review agency decisions, especially if they're agency decisions that are kind of streamlined and more vulnerable to legal attacks.
So I want to talk to you about a couple other pipelines. The first is Keystone XL pipeline, which was in the news a lot, in the early part of the 2010s. That, I understand, is on hold pending a court case. What can you tell us about that pipeline?
Keystone XL is another big one that, like you said, it was dominating the headlines, at least in the environmental and energy world. Several years ago, the Obama administration denied a permit for it. Same with Dakota Access. President Trump took office and said, let's get Keystone XL on track, let's build it, issued the final permits, and the company behind that pipeline, TC Energy, they want to move oil sands from Canada down into the U.S., and they have just run up against a constant battle in the courts, and a number of of adverse decisions. And the big decision that has delayed the pipeline right now, this is a pipeline that has not been built yet. The big decision that has delayed it is a federal court decision in Montana that said water permits for Keystone XL that came from the Army Corps of Engineers, that's the same agency involved in Dakota Access, that the water permits didn't comply with the Endangered Species Act. So the court scrapped this water permit for Keystone XL, and it went a step further, and it actually scrapped the whole permitting program that the Army Corps had used across the country. So no oil and gas pipeline, no new oil and gas pipeline could rely on this permitting program that they typically use. So the Supreme Court stepped in, and the Supreme Court said, okay, we're going to restart this permitting program for all the other oil and gas pipelines, but the permit is still on pause for Keystone XL, and it'll stay on pause while a federal appeals court takes a look at the case and decides what to do next.
Okay, so there's the Keystone XL, which is the big tar sands pipeline. Let's talk about another pipeline that there are no more court decisions apparently in this because the owners of the pipeline have decided to scrap it. It's the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. What can you tell us about that pipeline and why its owners, Dominion and Duke Energy, decided to pull the plug?
Atlantic Coast is a natural gas pipeline, or it was a proposed natural gas pipeline that would go from West Virginia to Virginia and North Carolina. And this project has been in the works since, I think 2014 was the first time that I wrote about it. So it goes back pretty far. Duke and Dominion have been fighting off all these legal battles for all that time. They're fighting over acquiring land, getting the right permits. They had a case about the pipeline crossing the Appalachian Trail. That case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they won. That was just about a month ago. And a few weeks later, they decided to pull the plug on the pipeline, which seemed pretty shocking to people who had followed just the Supreme Court battle. Like, okay, they won, so why are they giving up on this pipeline? The thing is, the Appalachian Trail issue was just one permitting uncertainty among a whole lot of other uncertainty. They were facing litigation over all these other federal permits. And so the developers just decided this is not worth our continued investment. So as a business decision, they decided to just give up on it.
So what do all of these decisions taken as a whole, I mean, are they affecting the oil and gas industry and these big mega projects that take, years and years to build and billions of dollars? Is this going to be harder to pull these off because of all these legal fights these companies have to face?
Definitely. These three pipelines show how sophisticated the environmental litigants and other litigants, tribal litigants, landowners, have become in challenging these projects. They have gotten to know all the best ways to file challenges in court, like which permits are likely to be most vulnerable and where they're likely to get traction. So they've really built up this very strong legal strategy, and it's been successful. And so project developers see that. Dominion and Duke saw that it wasn't worth their time or money anymore. Investors are getting a little skittish about it. They don't really want to have their money tied up for a decade of uncertainty. And the Trump administration is trying to reassure everybody that it's still worth their time. And they've been quite obviously very frustrated with the success of the environmental legal movement here.
I'm wondering too, I mean, it's obvious who it would be opposed to oil and gas pipelines and the opposition that they'd engender. But I think also sometimes when I read about these court battles, what's going to happen when we have a massive build out of renewable energy and there needs to be high voltage lines installed all across the U.S. or rail transit? Is this kind of a preview, do you think, of some of the legal strategies that people who don't want these to go through their land or their communities, that they might take these legal strategies to slow that kind of development?
There are definitely some of the same dynamics at play in the build out of renewable infrastructure as there are for pipelines. The National Environmental Policy Act, which is what has gotten in the way of Dakota Access, that has been used to fight big transmission projects that would help move electricity. So we'll definitely be seeing that in the renewable energy space, and we certainly already have. One example is there was a court case that's been going on the past several years about this big transmission line that would go across the James River in Virginia. And the environmental groups involved in that case, it was environmental groups and historic preservation groups. They won, but the court who was handling the case decided to keep the project in place. And they were going to require the federal government to do another review, but go ahead and keep the project in place. So some people have pointed to that as a kind of counterfactual, like, yeah, the same stuff could come up with renewable energy, but the fact that it's renewable energy or supports renewable energy could play into a judge's decision in whether to actually take a project down or not. But that won't always be the case. And it's certainly true that some big renewable projects could be derailed by not following environmental statutes. And I think a lot of environmental lawyers would be fine with that because they want to see that kind of energy infrastructure built out, but they also want it to be done in compliance with laws that are meant to protect endangered species and whatnot.
Yeah, and one of those laws is NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act. It just real quick, the Trump administration is rolling out sort of a revision that would sort of, I guess, in one way to say it is streamline the law, or in another way to say it is weaken the law. What impact do you think that could have on these kinds of mega projects, and what kind of legal challenges might it face?
So, yeah, the Trump administration, as we speak, is rolling out an update to NEPA regulations. So it's not changing the law itself, but it's changing these regulations that control how the law is implemented. And it could make it easier in some situations for projects to be built and withstand legal challenges that maybe previously were really focused on the regulations that are being rolled back. But at the end of the day, you still have the underlying law. And the crux of the underlying law is kind of a look before you leap, study the environmental impacts before you build the project, before you do the thing. That's always going to come back in all the litigation. So on some particulars, it's going to make it harder for environmentalists to challenge some decisions, but they've still got the entire statute to hook on to, and they'll just have to revamp their challenges to make sure they're rooted in the statute itself and not rooted in these particular regulations that are being rolled back.
Well, Ellen Gilmer, thanks so much for talking with me today about all this. Ellen Gilmer is a reporter with Bloomberg Law. Ellen, thank you.
Thank you.
Ellen Gilmer is a reporter with Bloomberg Law. This is Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Frazier. In a minute, what the Dakota Access decision means for the indigenous and climate movements that fought against it. Stay with us.
Hi, I'm Nate Cuban.
And I'm Reggie Cubis.
We're the sons of Trump on Earth producer Andy Cubis.
She works behind the scenes.
We think you should support this podcast on how do you say this word? Patreon. Because the environment matters for us kids.
Go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth to learn more.
You can pledge as little as $1 a month.
We can even afford that with our measly allowance, right, Nate?
Right. Thank you.
The decision by a U.S. District Court judge to shut down the Dakota Access pipeline was a big win for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe of North Dakota. Tribal members were the catalysts of a prolonged protest against the pipeline and have fought for years to have it stopped. Here to talk about what the decision means for the rights of America's indigenous people is Nick Tilsen. He's CEO of NDN Collective, a Native American rights and social justice organization. They're based in South Dakota. Nick is a member of the Oglala Lakota Nation. Nick, welcome, and thanks so much for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, we're going to talk about the issues surrounding the Dakota Access Pipeline and the legal decision. But I was just wondering if you could first just give me a sense of what it felt like when you first heard about this decision that the pipeline had to be stopped and drained of oil. What was your reaction?
My first reaction was a reaction of, it was pretty emotional, to be honest. So many of us, including myself, put our blood, sweat, and tears and sacrifice into the Oceti-Sakowin camp and the resistance against the Dakota Access pipeline. And a lot of us walked away from that pretty with some deep wounds, knowing that we were on the right side of history, knowing that we were on the right side of the issue. And, the DAPL and the Dakota Access pipeline, just represented the latest version of colonialism and imperialism towards indigenous people and a disrespect for Mother Earth. And so when I heard this news, it was an immediate feeling of healing, because it felt like that all of our sacrifices and commitment that we put in at the Oceti-Sakowin camp in the resistance against DAPL wasn't for nothing. That it actually contributed and created pressure to this ongoing narrative. Also, at the same time, anytime we ever hear as Indigenous people anything from any court ever, it's always a caution, because it feels like several times throughout this fight against the Dakota Access pipeline, we have had quote unquote good court decisions. We've had decisions that stalled the pipeline. We had decisions that did all of these things, and so we don't really trust the court systems. I mean, the fact that a federal judge has ordered the pipeline for the oil to stop flowing in the pipeline, and that the company has refused it, and that oil is still now flowing in the pipeline, we don't have a whole lot of trust in the court system, and especially because we feel like the court systems tends to favor corporations over people, definitely when it comes to its relationship with Indigenous people. So we are cautiously optimistic. It's a great decision from a legal standpoint, because so many of our complaints in the entire issue had to do with that they actually didn't even do a good process that actually correctly and accurately consulted Indigenous people, but also that the actual pipeline itself and the technology and everything that has to do with it is a threat to millions and millions of Americans.
Yeah, and I just want to go back to some terminology here that you used that some of our listeners may not be aware of. Oceti-Sakowin or Oceti-Sakowin. Just tell our listeners what that means.
So Oceti-Sakowin is the 7 council fires, and Oceti-Sakowin was our traditional form of governance, before colonization. So you have the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota people, and Oceti-Sakowin was the 7 council fires in which we came together to make decisions for the future of our nation. And when the resistance camp was created at Standing Rock, there was a deliberate, conscious decision made to call it the Oceti-Sakowin camp, because we weren't just fighting a pipeline. We were revitalizing our culture. We were revitalizing some of our traditional governance structures, and at the same time that we were fighting for this. So that's why, the deeper meaning of why the camp was called Oceti-Sakowin, because it was actually for the first time in hundreds of years, it was the meeting of the 7 council fires and a revival and a reconnection to that structure.
Not to go on too much of a tangent, but this seems important. I've seen it written that Oceti-Sakowin basically means Anglo or white people or Americans mean when they say the word Sioux, as in the Sioux tribe. Is that how we should understand it?
In some ways, I mean, I think, the Oceti-Sakowin is made up of several bands. So, for example, I'm from the Oglala band of the Lakota people who are part of the Oceti-Sakowin. The Oglala is my band, Lakota is my language, and the greater societal group that I'm part of is Oceti-Sakowin. Sioux is an inaccurate historical term that I choose not to use ever, because it's not what we call ourselves.
Got it. I understand. So it was pejorative at one point?
It was a term used by other tribes to refer to us. When the white folks came, to the folks of the Great Lakes region and others, they said, who are the people over there? And they said the Sioux, which meant enemy, because we were the enemies to some of these other warring tribes. And so then whenever folks came to our territory, white folks and French fur trappers and stuff came to our territory, they're like, you're the Sioux. And we're like, no, we're Lakota. It's crazy because Lakota means friend or ally. So that's what happens. That's what happens when you get white people mixed up in the middle. They really mess things up.
Yeah. So talking about white people getting in the middle of things, let's talk a little bit about the issues surrounding the pipeline and just refresh our memories. Why were the Standing Rock Sioux opposed to this pipeline? As the proponents of the pipeline argued and continue to argue, none of it crossed their reservation. So why were they so opposed?
So yeah, first I want to say so the Standing Rock Sioux tribe is the Hunkpapa Ihanktuan people, and they are a member of the Osheti Shakoi. And so just because we have, in South Dakota and, we have 9 reservations, and Standing Rock is both on the South Dakota side and it's on the North Dakota side. The water, the Missouri River is one of the biggest, waterways of drinking water, and it provides drinking water to 18 million Americans, and it provides water and life to so many tribes, including the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and the Hunkpapa people. And so to us, these arbitrary borders, right? The fact that the reservation ends right here, and then they build a pipeline just north of it. The reason why people are so against it is because it was crossing the river just north of the reservation. And the interesting fact is originally the pipeline was going to be crossing north of the town of Bismarck, but the white folks were against it. They didn't want the pipeline crossing north of their town or their community. So then they moved it to north of the reservation. And then throughout that whole area, there is burial grounds, there is sacred sites, all throughout that entire area that's off the reservation. And then many of those sites are supposed to be protected, even though they're off the reservation. And so, this is a multi-layered issue here, because you've seen the Dakota Access Pipeline Company come in and destroy some sacred sites in the construction of the pipeline, it going under the Missouri River, which provides water to 18 million people. And so these are all reasons why all of the indigenous people in this region were against it. Because in our language, we say "mini wichoni," water is life. It's kind of become like a hashtag now in the 21st century. But actually, it's a very simple thing. But our entire bodies are made up of water, and society lives off of water. And so this became a huge battle about the importance of protecting our natural resources. And as indigenous people, we have fought for so long to protect our natural resources, because we know that they're fundamentally important and directly connected to our survival as a people. So to us, it doesn't make sense to put a pipeline underneath the river where 80% of these pipelines leak. It's not a matter of if they're going to leak. It's a matter of when they're going to leak. I think the other big thread here that's fundamentally important is that we're in the 21st century where we can be creating new energy solutions for this nation. This pipeline is a pipeline to pass into the old energy systems that contribute to climate change, that contribute to injustice, that contribute to exploitation of land, community, and people. And so this pipeline, was a representation of this old system and way of doing things, when we actually got to be leaning in collectively as a society to coming up with new solutions for our communities and for our people. And that the issue of water and climate and land and human rights are fundamentally at the crux of some of the most important issues facing humanity today. And I think that's why the DAPL issue became such a global phenomenon issue, is because eventually every single community that is fighting for their survival can relate to this issue.
Yeah, I want to talk about that, because in some sense, the DAPL protests were a local issue. People didn't want this thing crossing their backyard. But in another sense, seems like it took on more of a global issue in the sense that, plenty of environmentalists from around the country came, but there seemed to be a nexus between what the Standing Rock folks were fighting for and, this wave of climate activism that we're seeing in a lot of different populations really around the world. What are your thoughts on that? Do you see these two movements converging, and how?
I mean, I think that indigenous people have been directly impacted by climate exponentially more than other places. Look at the Gwich'in. Look at the Gwich'in in the National Arctic Wildlife Refuge up there in the north. If you look at the biodiversity on the planet, you got about 75 to 80% of the biodiversity that's left on the planet is left within close proximity to stewardship of indigenous people. That's not an accident. That's not an accident. And biodiversity is what we need in order to combat global climate change, right? And so, indigenous people have been on the front lines of environmental and climate issues long before there was an Earth Justice, long before there was a Greenpeace, long before there was an NRDC. Indigenous people have been there resisting these things. And I think that also indigenous people, like the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, have a unique relationship to the federal government. We're not just another sort of racial group, right? We have actually unique political relationship. And so all of a sudden, us as indigenous people, not only putting our risk and being on the front lines of this issue, we also are able to leverage and use our unique political relationship with the federal government to apply pressure on the company and on the processes of the government. And so when you think about these movements converging, to us, I mean, to be honest, for most of us as indigenous people, it was about our land and protecting our communities and our people, right? Obviously, we understand climate change because we see it happening in society, right? It's in our prophecies. And I think some people think, oh, hey, that's something mystical, indigenous from a long time ago. Well, there's prophecies that exist that happened in the last few years about this pipeline in our ceremonies. I think the convergence of these movements is important because I think that in order for the climate movement to be successful, the climate movement has to relate to everyday people. And it can't be just science-based. It has to be human-based. This is how it impacts human beings in society today. And then when you look at the lines, right, of who is pursuing the narrative behind that climate change is a myth, who's pushing that narrative? It's transnational corporations who are profiteering off of the suffering of people and contributing to climate change. It's political leaders like Donald Trump. It's folks who benefit from the economics of the fossil fuel industry. And then if you look about how the government responded to a group of indigenous people resisting on their own land, it's the same way they have always responded. When indigenous people come together, this country gets scared. And we were confronted with militarization. The fact that we came into this situation, the National Guard was called in, Tiger Swan, a private security company, was hired by Dakota Access Pipeline. And that's where the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter said, hey, we see what you're going through. Brothers and sisters, if you need help up there, you let us know. And people from Ferguson and the movement for Black Lives, they showed up at Standing Rock. And that's where I really, tend to think and believe really strongly that the collective liberation of these movements are intrinsically bound up with one another.
I want to talk about some of the backlash that the tribes may have experienced as a result of their resistance to the pipeline. What was the reaction of white North Dakotans? I mean, that state is now an oil state, and that pipeline is designed to, get that oil out of that region and to, the rest of the country. Was there any kind of negative backlash towards Native Americans?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you can start by the justice system. I was one of the first people in Standing Rock charged with a felony up there for doing nonviolent direct action civil disobedience to stopping construction equipment from digging the pipeline. And they came down on us hard and tried to tie everybody up in the courts. The reality is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these cases got dropped eventually because they were overcharges in the first place. I think the other thing, the decision to close the road because we were camped not on the road, but we were camped next to the road. We were not blocking traffic. That was a strategic decision made by the governor of North Dakota and the National Guard to block that road, which had a direct impact, an economic impact to the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. And to this day, one of the revenue generators for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe is Prairie Knights Casino. And Prairie Knights Casino has never gotten the revenues back up since the protest at DAPL. And the narrative is, oh, it's because of those protesters. I'm like, bullshit, it's not because of those protesters. It's because the government and the National Guard decided to close down the main transportation artery going to the reservation, making it difficult for people to go there. And then you lay on top of that the racist media in Mandan and Bismarck contributing to this idea that there's these dangerous Indians. The last people that you should be fearing is the unarmed, peaceful protesters. You should be fearing the people that are militarizing this entire area. If there's anybody to fear the people with the power and the guns. And these are racial connotations that have continued to have a direct impact on the economics of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, for sure.
And just to go back to the road blockage, we're talking about Highway 1806 that was just north of the camps. It was, according to an Associated Press story, the bridge was damaged by fires during one clash, but the bridge was deemed structurally sound in January 2017, but authorities didn't reopen it for 2 more months. Just to give a little background about what the road closures were.
I want to say one quick thing on that. That was bullshit. They never made improvements to that bridge to reopen it. It means that not only was it deemed safe in January, it means that the entire time that it was closed, it was actually safe. They just used that as a damn excuse as a strategy to cut off a main artery of the transportation to negatively impact an entire group of people. I mean, if that's not white supremacy and racial injustice in work, I don't know what is.
And just to add to that, there is a lawsuit, or was in 2018, filed by 2 members of the Standing Rock tribe over that shutdown, saying that it violated their constitutional rights. I got to ask, this decision about the Dakota Access pipeline came basically at the same exact time that the Supreme Court issued a monumental ruling in Oklahoma, ruling that most of eastern Oklahoma belonged to the Muskogee Creek Nation in a case called McGirt. And basically the same day or week that the NFL franchise in Washington, D.C. decided to retire the Redskins name and logo. And let me just say, as a Steeler fan and just person, good riddance to that logo and name. I'm just wondering, as a Native American, what do these decisions or victories or moments feel like right now?
They feel that we're making progress. It feels like that we're being not only seen in modern day society today, but that we're being able to take that visibility and put it into action. And it's a result of us building power as a people. Because I want to clarify something here. The NFL did not wake up and do the right thing. That's not what happened here. Indigenous people organized, and we forced the damn NFL to do the right thing. We made it so unpopular for them that they had to do the right thing. And so I want to be clear here, because I think that the NFL and the National Football League and the Redskins and all the different owners, try to say, oh, we're making the right decision to do this at this right time in history. But let's get the story straight. Indigenous people have been organizing against this particular issue for a long, long time. And the climate in the country was actually really created under the leadership of the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter. I think that the other thing is, if we're going to talk about a society that works for all people and that we're actually going to work towards racial justice and racial equity, Indigenous people cannot be othered. We cannot be like, oh, shit, we got to worry about them too. We actually have to have that conversation at the exact same time. And so I think that's part of what's happening as we're in this time of social consciousness and social reckoning of a nation. And I think that that's what's so interesting about these times, right? Many of us, I'm 38 years old, but many of us who are activists, organizers, change makers in society today, we're continuing on the work of the ancestors who've come before us. Many of the things that we're fighting for here, the American Indian movement, different tribal leaders, some that are still alive today, have been saying the exact same things that we're fighting for today, but we're being able to see fruits of that labor being generated in society today. But it's because the climate of the country is different. And so I think what it feels to us is that we're not just against things, right? And we're not just against everything that's happening to Indigenous people. We actually want to radically imagine a future of this country in this world that actually includes Indigenous people and doesn't actually have us being in the past, but has us being in the present. And I think when you start seeing huge tracts of land being controlled, injustices being reversed, like Dakota Access pipeline, the Redskins being shut down, then we're starting to realize a vision that is better for this country, and that is not only better for Indigenous people, but is better for everybody.
What do you see as sort of the next stage in this struggle that you and others are waging for Indigenous rights, but also for some of the other issues that you're talking about: social justice, racial justice, climate justice?
So a few things. One, I want to make sure that all the listeners out there, that we don't actually let Dakota Access pipeline and energy transfer partners, off the hook. A federal judge has ordered that pipeline to close. There is still oil flowing through that pipeline because they have chosen to appeal it. The next stage is going to be an environmental impact, study. And basically, the Army Corps of Engineers, from direction from the White House, has basically said, "How dare you," to a federal judge. "How dare you tell us we didn't follow this process?" That's the climate of the situation here. And I'll say to the listeners out there, I don't put my trust into the court system. I believe in the power of the people. I believe that there will come a time that the only way that this actually gets shut down is people have to enforce that company to actually close down the pipeline. Because if we leave the federal courts to just make them do that, we're just going to see appeal after appeal, and we're going to keep seeing oil go through that pipeline and continue to put people at danger. So it's going to take the power of a movement and a people to actually push towards the closure of this pipeline.
Well, Nick Tilsen, thank you so much for talking with me.
Absolutely.
Nick Tilsen is president and CEO of NDN Collective. Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. If you like our show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. You can find all of our episodes online at trumponearth.org and anywhere you get your podcasts. While you're at it, write a review or tell your friends about it. The podcast is supported by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Kathy Nauer is the executive producer. I'm Reed Frazier. Please stay safe. We'll see you next time.